Hello, welcome to your very first edition of Notes online with an online lecture. I apologize profusely that we are not going to be able to have one-on-one meetings for the rest of this semester, but I decided to go ahead and try this format, and I just want to make a note ahead of time that if you have any questions that pop up to you during the lecture or just anything about the course in general, always feel free to post that in the discussion, the one that says help please and or please help, and I will be more than happy to try and answer whatever questions you have for the semester. Just moving forward for the semester, I plan on placing all the lectures in the modules tab, and this one's the first. I'm going to use a couple of different formats throughout the semester to try and see which one works the best for you guys. But I'm going with the slideshow format for today. And so, in thinking about that, I want to go ahead and go back to the very beginning of the semester and kind of preview and talk about what we have ahead for this semester. So what we've already covered for this semester falls under the field of normative ethics. We've talked about that before. I'll preview that just a little bit more. But what we still have ahead is meta ethics and applied ethics. And if you remember, when we were discussing this at the beginning of the semester, we pretty much broke ethics down into those three categories, where we said that normative ethics help us deal with conflicts of interest. Meta ethics help us explore the nature of the good, and applied ethics are how we take both those theories and put them into real life practice. And so, that being said, I want to go ahead and delve into what we're going to talk about for the next 2 weeks here. If you can, go ahead and go to the next slide. I know that many of you would love to see my wonderful face for all of these, but I'm actually going to turn over on these next couple of slides to just audio so that you can just hear me and you don't have to worry about seeing my beautiful curtains in my house or any of my children if they happen to pop in today. So going back over to what we've talked about so far this semester, we looked very hard into normative ethics, and if you remember, we broke normative ethics down into three basic categories. Those that are agency-based, which is the people who are involved in situations. Those that are action-based, which is just focusing on the principles of action themselves. And those that are consequentialist-based, which is focusing on the results of those actions. And I've got them listed here. I'm sure you remember them from your midterm, but so far we've more or less covered 7 different normative theories of ethics, and those are usually considered the most kind of classical views of ethics. If someone were to ask you about ethics, chances are that's what they're thinking. It's those 3 different categories. If you were stranded on an island and you had to name just 3 ethical theories that universally everybody knows about, probably the 3 that people are wanting you to recite are virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and utilitarianism. Obviously, I delve into some of the other ethics because I think that they have valid ways of viewing the world as well. But let's not spend a whole lot of time on the review today because we need to see what we're going to talk about up ahead. And so, what we're tackling this semester, or this part of the semester, is metaethics. And as I have posted here, metaethics deals with the nature of goodness, and it's really concerned with knowing what is meant by ethical truths. And as we look at metaethics, again, this isn't going to be the most significant part of the course. It's going to be just the next 2 weeks that we're looking at here. But in looking at that, I think there's a healthy and kind of intuitive way of breaking down metaethics. And so I'm going to show you on the next slide here. There's lots of ways that we could categorize metaethics, and there's a lot of meta-ethical theories that we're not going to look at this semester. So just like with the normative theories, there are other ones that I could have shown you, but I chose kind of the 7 that are the most classical and famous. Same way here, we're going to talk about just four basic kind of ideas in metaethics. But I think the best way of breaking these down is talking about them in terms of whether or not they follow a religious nature or a non-religious nature. And so for this first week of metaethics, we're going to take a look at divine command theory and pluralism, and both of those are steeped in a religious view of the world and looking at ethics from a religious standpoint. On the non-religious side, we have relativism and objectivism, and we're going to talk about those. And what I think is interesting is that these kind of correlate to each other. So divine command theory has a lot of the same ideas that objectivism has, and pluralism and relativism sometimes are confused for each other. They're so similar. But in looking at it, I want to make one of the main kind of differences that we're going to look at in metaethics, the difference between the religious kind of metaethics and non-religious metaethics. And I want to emphasize that term non-religious because I'm not saying that you have to be an atheist to believe the other ones. It's just they're not steeped in religious ideals. And so, talking about divine command theory today, I think is the best way to kind of begin a discussion about metaethics, because in a lot of ways, thinking about divine command theory ultimately kind of exposes how people, whether they're religious or not, how people ultimately approach metaethics. If I can just show you really quick here some of the illustrations that you see in the bottom right hand corner is one of the most famous kind of paintings of God, where his arms are stretched out and trying to save humanity, and even though you can't see the full picture, you can see Adam's finger that's kind of just lingering there and kind of apathetical, while God's like stretching out his hand. If you look at the top left-hand corner, that's actually a picture of Krishna and Arjuna, and this is from what's called the Mahabharata. It's a poem called the Bhagavad Gita. It's one of the most famous poems in Hinduism, and it's a time where Krishna, who is a reincarnation of the deity Vishnu, visits Arjuna and goes to talk to him about kind of how he should deal with this situation where he's in a battle that he has to fight against his entire family. And Krishna kind of confronts him about the meaning of his life at the very beginning of this battle. The last kind of thing I just want to talk about is if you compare the top right hand corner of this kind of excavation that people have done down in Argentina and the bottom left hand corner, it probably seems apparent to you that these are two very different kinds of civilizations, two extraordinarily different societies. In much the same way that the bottom right and the top left convey two different ideas about their deities as well. And what I want to point out is the thing that kind of ties together all of these pictures and all of these portraits is a general belief in some sort of deity, in some sort of religious order to the universe. And so divine command theory is really this one basis of understanding that we have for morality that really begins by just saying there is some sort of religious order to the universe that is absolutely true. And so if I can, I want to show you on the next slide some of these kind of basic claims that divine command theory makes. First of all, I want to point out the fact that no one actually calls their ethical point of view divine command theory. So if you were to walk into a church or temple or any kind of religious gathering, none of them are going to say, today is the day that we're going to learn about divine command theory. Instead, divine command theory is an idea that's used by philosophers to articulate a kind of similarity between various religious views. And so ultimately, the basis for any divine command theory itself is that morality comes from God's commands, or another way of saying that is just whatever God commands is moral. Now, the reason why we use a term like divine command theory is because even though all religions are different from each other in various ways, there's some commonly held ways in which they articulate the relationship between religion and morality. And so philosophers use the term divine command theory to talk about those generalizations where there is overlap in thinking about these ideas. And generally, the relationship between religion and philosophy people think of as this kind of antagonistic one. But divine command theory is actually used by theologians and philosophers alike to ultimately try and articulate what this relationship between morality and religion ends up being. And so there's different generalizations that people use to talk about divine command theory. One of the most famous ways that we can start to think about the difference between religions and ultimately the way in which people try to articulate this relationship between God's commands or a deity's commands and morality is really just to ask the question about the relationship between them. And so in a Socratic dialogue, that's one of the dialogues that Plato writes using Socrates as kind of the mouthpiece for Plato's ideas. In what's called the Euthyphro, he poses this question, Socrates does, he poses this question to Euthyphro. He says, ultimately, if we think about piety or holiness, what is it that makes piety or holiness good? Is it good because it's what God commands, or does God command it because it's good? Right. And so if we think about this in terms of morality, right, the real question I've got posed here is, right, ultimately, is morality moral because it is commanded by God? That is, does God's command make it moral, right? Or is it commanded by God because it's moral? And usually implied with that is, and God is good. So ultimately, what we're trying to tackle here is the question that I asked you in your discussion. Do you think that morality is above religious beliefs, or are religious beliefs above morality? And this is kind of the central question about divine command theory, is trying to figure out, well, how do we figure out if God commands moral actions? How do we figure out if that's because God is in control, or because it's actually that morality itself is some sort of universal principle? And so in thinking about this, one distinction that's helpful to make is the different ways in which God could command goodness. And so I want to make a distinction between two different ideas here, and these are your two big money words for the day. The first distinction that we can make is what's called epistemological divine command theory. And just to repeat that really quick here, it's epistemological. So epistemological. That's terrible the way I just said that, right? But epistemology itself is the theory of knowledge, or the study of theories of knowledge. And so epistemological, used in this context, just means something in particular about knowledge. And so in epistemological divine command theory, what it basically says is the answer to this question is that God's commands are right because God knows what is right, and he commands what is right. And so in thinking about this, There is on one end a kind of claim that's easy for people who believe in divine command theory to think about, and that is that God's knowledge allows God to discern right from wrong, and so God isn't actually in control of morality, but God uses his kind of omniscience, his um, ability to know everything about the universe in order to discern all of the possibilities of right and wrong, and to mention or to command, I should say, which ones are right. The problem with this is that it seems as though God lacks some power because God's commands are conforming to morality instead of God's commands being morality. And so a lot of theologians reject this view. Typically, the people who hold on to this view, particularly in the Western kind of world, are deemed heretics because, again, it seems as though you're placing morality above God in this context. More recent kind of theologians, people who espouse ideas like what's been termed open theism, they actually have very interesting kind of arguments for why this could seem to be true. So if you were to think of the mind of God as this kind of like supercomputer that analyzes all the possibilities of everything that exists, they would point out that there really isn't a power in the sense of morality that you're thinking of that renders God's power obsolete by, again, God conforming his knowledge towards this understanding of all kind of possible moral arrangements. If that's a bridge too far for you to think about, just keep in mind again that the basic claim of epistemological divine command theory is just simply that God knows what is right and wrong. He relies on his knowledge of good and evil, or good and wrong, right and wrong, whatever phrase you want to use there. And from that knowledge, God commands what is right. So your other big money word for today is ontological, ontological divine command theory. And ontology in philosophy is this field of study about the nature of being, what it means for something to be. And so in ontological divine command theory, God's commands ultimately are good because of who God is. God's being is the source of goodness. And so instead of God's knowledge determining what is right and wrong in ontological divine command theory, it's actually just who God is what determines what is right, and subsequently what is wrong. And in this arrangement, the main problem that comes about is that it seems like it trivializes morality, because if God decides to change God's mind, right, God can command whatever, whenever he wants to, and that automatically changes the moral nature of a particular action. So if one day God decides that people are supposed to count 20 seconds while they're washing their hands, and that's the good thing to do, then the next day God could decide that maybe you only need to count 10 seconds, and that's the good thing. And so the big problem that people see with ontological divine command theory is that it seems to make morality trivial, because ultimately God's commands can be changed at any time. Now, a lot of people who look at this idea ultimately argue back that God is this unchanging sort of existence in the universe, and so even though it's possible that God's commands could change, they never do. And there's a lot of different ways of interpreting this view of divine command theory as well. But again, the main distinction to be made here is that instead of focusing on God's ability to understand morality, this is focused much more on God's own essence, God's ability to give commands, as opposed to God's understanding. And so that's the main distinction between these two different theories. Now, I understand that some of you are probably better visual learners than you are just listening to this whole lecture. And so this next slide is really just kind of a way of visualizing a contrast between these two different theories. So if we go with what we just talked about, ontological divine command theory, the kind of view of this one is that every single action that you could ever think of, every single moral principle that could ever be thought of, they all exist in one single cup. And in the ontological divine command theory, what happens is that God pulls out those actions and he looks at them and he arbitrarily says, this one is good and this one is bad. This one is good and this one is bad. And he goes through the whole cup, sorting them out, deciding, between the two, which one is good and which one is bad. In epistemological divine command theory, the cups are divided out, and God can clearly see which one is marked good and which one is marked bad or evil or whatever term you want to use with that. And all that God has to do is convey that understanding. So he pulls out some things from the cup that says good, he pulls some things out from the cup that says bad, and he just repeats that. He says, okay, the ones that were in the cup labeled good, those are the good things, and the ones that are in the cup that are labeled bad are bad things. Again, this is meant to give you kind of a visual contrast between these two different ideas. So in thinking about this distinction of divine command theory and what the basis of morality ultimately is. Again, whichever camp you fall into, at the end of the day, the idea behind divine command theory is that God's commands themselves are moral because it's what God is commanding. And so again, the reasons for that can be different from either side. But a big question kind of remains in each one of these about what the nature of God ultimately is. On this slide, I've got a couple of different pictures of ways in which people have viewed God. And if we go through them really quick here, on the top left-hand corner, I've got the picture of this Aztecan kind of ritual where someone would be sacrificed for the sun god in order to keep the harvest moving throughout the year. And so this would happen. I've been told every day, and there are variations every week, every month, every year, so on and so forth. But it's not unusual within different religions to have some sort of sacrificial property where some type of blood is required in order to keep a certain rights of the world continuing on. And again, the word right there should be used in the context of RITE and not RIGHT as like a legal right. But there is a connection between both of those words. They come from the Sanskrit word Rita, which is this kind of divine order of the universe. And if you look at this picture of Charlton Heston being Moses, there is this kind of story, in the Old Testament about Moses being this kind of chosen individual who pulls these slaves out of Egypt, only to have them kind of become rebellious as they leave Egypt, and given these laws by God. And in looking at these different kind of aspects of God, there's one way that we could interpret the nature of God as being this kind of lawgiver, as this entity that requires sacrifice in some sort of way. There's a Black Mirror episode that I have up here at the top, where they kind of pull this to this like full fruition, where this crazy kind of computer programmer who makes these like genetic copies of people that he works with and puts them into this computer simulated universe that he uses to command them in his own universe to do whatever it is he wants them to do. And in the episode itself, it basically says that the captain of the ship is this horrible individual, right? Because he's forcing people to do the things that he wants them to do. And so some people can look at that idea about God and ultimately come away with the fact that, like, no matter what God commands, if that's true, it seems as though God, or the pantheon of gods and goddesses, whatever deity it is that we're talking about, if it's true that they simply are commanding people to do things for their own amusement, there seems to be something sadistic about that. There seems to be something we might even term inhumane. And in thinking about that, I want to pull your attention over to this right-handed figure, which is found in Hinduism. And this is a picture of what's called Shiva the Destroyer. And the main idea in Hinduism is that there is this, well, not the main idea, but the main idea behind this is that there's really this act of destruction that comes with an act of creation. That as the world is being destroyed, it's also being remade. And one of the basic kind of answers that people use towards this criticism of divine command theory, that what God is ultimately doing is playing the sadistic game where he forces, or he or she or it, depending on which deity we're talking about, it forces human beings to follow these sometimes impossible commands. The answer that sometimes people levy against this is just simply that the knowledge that human beings have cannot surmount or equal the understanding that a deity possesses, and that for reasons that we are unable to observe, the universe itself is in some ways being remade, shaped, or formed to a higher level that supersedes our own understanding, that supersedes our own ability to really make that part of our reality fit together with the rest of our lives. And in this depiction of Shiva destroying the universe at the same moment that the universe is also being created, there's really just this idea that creation and destruction themselves are fairly neutral forces. They're like a tsunami that's coming through and destroying everything that you see. When you're part of that tsunami, it seems evil and wrong to you because you're being swept underneath it. And you're going to die from it most likely. But as a observer outside of that, or even if you were the water, you would see that differently. Not necessarily as an evil kind of like force, but just a part of nature itself. And so that really brings us back to this question about the nature of God, because a lot of different people, when they're assessing this idea that God's commands bear this type of like evil with them, just simply point out the fact that from our perspective, we see destruction, we see evil. But ultimately, from other perspectives, you can see that this destruction or these commands that seem to be wrong in a completely different light. And so this last picture I have down here in the bottom left-hand corner, most religions also have some notion of a benevolent God. And there are different ideas that are kept in there. This is a painting of a particular passage in the Bible where it says that God will wipe away all the tears from people's eyes. But you can look at other religions throughout the world, and they also contain different notions of compassion, different ideas of benevolence. Jainism is probably most famous for the fact that its adherents won't even kill bugs. They won't even swipe at different things, insects that are around them, and they have particular methods and brushes that they use to make sure they don't step on creatures and they disturb the universe as least possible amount of ways that they can. And so in thinking about that, there's really this kind of big question about what ultimately is the nature of God. And that informs to some degree what we think of as the nature of the relationship between morality and divine command theory. Very few people really take seriously the idea that if they go out and they step on like an ant colony, that they're destroying an entire civilization of ants. And yet, when we think about the magnitude of how large the universe is compared to human beings, we're significantly smaller and probably much more insignificant than the ant is as a relationship towards us human beings. And so another way that people approach thinking about this kind of nature of God is sometimes what's called from a deist perspective, which is, God creates the universe, but then leaves it to its own devices. And so how people view the nature of God ultimately, in some ways, determines how they see the relationship unfold between morality and God. So probably the most famous criticism against divine command theory is really just questioning whether or not God actually ever gives commands towards human beings. And so there's this kind of move that philosophers sometimes tend to make where they say something along the lines of there may well indeed be a God that exists, but our ability to understand or decode that God's thoughts or ideas about morality are far removed from our own understanding, are far removed from our own ability to think about them. And one of the main ways in which people kind of cast doubt about the morality of divine command theory is to point towards different religious orders, different religious commands that people follow almost universally in religions, and show how those commands suspiciously seem to mirror what is in human beings' own interest, or if you take maybe even a deeper look at it, how they mirror desires within that within their own society. And so probably, the best example of a suspicious command in this order are the ones that ask people to die or kill honorably for the sake of the deity. And so if you look at, Danish culture, Viking culture, one of the main ideas in that is that in order to reach the Feast of Valhalla, you have to have some type of weapon in your hand. You have to die as a warrior. And so looking at that, what a great coincidence that in a warrior society, the main religious belief is that you have to die with a weapon in your hand. Different societies throughout history have had this kind of honor culture where if someone kills, then you are required, right, through your religious ideals, to avenge that killing. And this is found in the Old Testament. This is found in the Quran. This is found throughout most early kind of like civilizations where, again, people are supposed to take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so on. And so we can look at that as a suspicious sort of like command. Two that I think are interesting and kind of relevant for the time period that we're talking about right now is abstaining from red meat during the largest reproduction cycle of the year. Looking at that, it's not a coincidence that things like Lent fall in the same part of the calendar where animals are trying to reproduce. Because if you ate red meat during cycles like Lent, you wouldn't have enough, sheep or cows or whatever it is that you're you're trying to reproduce. You wouldn't have enough of them to meet the demand throughout the year. And so, whereas this can seem like it's a very religious sort of command, we see universally that religions adopt these sorts of commands, and it really seems as though it's in the interest of the society at large. And so one of the other things that we could look at is ultimately the demand for a death or sacrifice of either humans or deities in nearly every religion as well. And so, as I pointed out in the Bhagavad Gita, the central kind of question is whether or not Arjuna should be fighting against his family members. And if we just look, globally at different religions that exist, this tends to be a big question over and over again throughout the Bible. You had the reading that we had for today about Abraham and Isaac, but you also have questions of like David and Saul, and even the central kind of claim of Christianity is the fact that Jesus died for the remission of everyone's sins. There is a question within Islam about taking revenge on individuals who disgrace the name of Islam. And really just looking globally at the idea of demanding a death or a sacrifice of life, it seems to be a part of almost every kind of religion that exists. And in addition to this, probably the most interesting kind of suspicious command that we could look at is just how many different reincarnations and expansions of the same faith really exist. One of these kind of classical examples of this is that, Christianity is a transplant of Judaism, and within Christianity, you have several other kind of transplanted ideas. So there's even, Mormonism is kind of a transplanted Christianity, and within any religion, it seems as though you have these sacred texts and these prophets or ministers or deities who give commands within that religion, but then those commands themselves get amended and changed and expanded upon as new people enter that religion. And so it seems very suspicious that a religion that is commanded by a deity in the beginning changes its commands. And probably one of the most famous examples of this is when Jesus is preaching on the Sermon on the Mount. He goes through this list of things where he says, you've been told this, but I say this to you instead. And so even taking that proposition, right, of that, take an eye for an eye, right? But I tell you to, love the least of these, and just on and on. There are different ways that we can look at how religions say in extreme terms that people are supposed to do one particular sort of thing, braid their hair a certain way, have particular birth kind of rites, eat certain types of animals, just an exhaustive list of things. And then later, someone else in that religion gives a different command, that it's okay to not braid your hair that way, that it's okay to eat animals that you weren't allowed to before, that it's okay, right, to drive a car now that they've been invented to your religious ceremony, and so on and so forth. And so, bearing these differences in mind, I think it's helpful for us to go ahead and look at the story that you had for today, the story that's found in Genesis about Abraham and Isaac. And what I want to point out is that three of the world's biggest religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all have a shared view of Abraham as the father of many nations. And in fact, they have versions of this story. So the story that's found in Genesis is considered orthodox to both Judaism as well as Christianity. In Islam, they have a similar story to this, but instead of Isaac being the chosen son, it's actually Ishmael who is the chosen son. And in looking at this story, there's really a couple of different things that stick out about divine command theory. Probably the most famous part of this, or the part that we've talked a lot about online, is whether or not Abraham should have actually gone through with God's command, whether or not what God was commanding was actually moral. And so one of the reasons why I choose this story is because it helps think through the dilemma about where morality's place actually is. Again, the kind of theme through metaethics is to really wonder and ask, what is the nature of goodness? And so, is God subservient to goodness, or is goodness subservient to God? Is there an equality between them? So on and so forth. Sometimes I have people talk about this in terms of the fact that, like, well, Abraham must be a complete raging psychopath because he's willing to kill his child. And I would point out the fact that, again, looking at this from the standpoint of divine command theory, if you believe that what God commands is right, that there's no possible way God could command something that is immoral, then really the dilemma here is in questioning not why God is asking you to kill your son, but why it is that you believe that is a wrong sort of thing to do. And so on one level, we can look at it and just say, well, it seems as though there's some principles, again, going back to what we mentioned in deontology, right? There's some principles that are universal no matter what, that we should never use people to try and accomplish our own ends, right? And so we should never see people as a means to our own ends. And in this instance, it seems like that's what God is asking Abraham to do. But then there's another way of thinking about this as well, which is that if goodness itself, as Kant points out, wills its own ends, then it wills the means towards those ends. And so again, if God is sovereign, if God is good in this sense, and God is asking for the sacrifice of Abraham, then it seems, or Isaac, then it seems as though God has the means towards those ends as well. And I noticed that some of you in your posts even kind of made a point about this and pointing out the fact that God provided a ram for Abraham to sacrifice over Isaac. But I want to raise a different sort of question about this as well to get you thinking about it maybe a little bit more in depth. And that is, what if you were not Abraham in this situation, but what if you were the person observing Abraham? So I usually, when I'm talking about this in class, will point out the fact, I'm like, what if your professor was just told, right, that he was supposed to kill one of his classmates, right? Now pull out like a marker or something like that, and I'll be like, right, what if I claim to you that I heard the word of God telling me, right, that I was supposed to kill someone in this classroom? How would you go about thinking about that? Because either I am under a misapprehension of some sorts, or God is truly asking me to kill someone. So if you would put yourself in the position of, say, like Abraham's wife, and she's not privileged in being able to hear the voice of God tell Abraham this, and undoubtedly Abraham is going to go to his wife and say, hey, God is telling me to kill our son, so I need to go and do it. A second thing to think about in this story as well is the fact that it seems as though God changes God's mind. So at the beginning, God tells Abraham to kill his son Isaac, but then later on he says no, right? No, he doesn't even do that. He just sends an angel, right? And the angel says, no, don't do that. Offer the ram instead. And so in thinking about that, why would God ask Abraham to do something, only to ask Abraham not to do that later on. And sometimes people give a very unsatisfying answer of saying something along the lines of like that this is a test that God wants to see Abraham do. And that God already knows like what the answer is going to be from Abraham's perspective. But if that's the case, then there's no point in giving the test to begin with. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about the nature of God and whether or not God is kind of sadistic in a certain way. And so where I want to end this discussion is actually talking about the answer that a philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard actually gives to this particular question. And so if I can, I'm going to put it on this next slide here. So what Kierkegaard ultimately answers to this question is that he says we basically have kind of three levels of judgments that we make about the world. And he says that when we're young, we make aesthetic judgments. And what he means by this is general judgments about things that appeal to us. And so if we see something like a cookie jar that is close to us, right, we instinctively might grab that cookie jar. And if we grab that cookie jar and it falls on the floor and breaks and shatters everywhere, and we cut ourselves really badly, right, we maybe learn from that aesthetic judgment that, you know, grabbing the cookie jar was not such a pleasing kind of ideal. And so as we get older, from Kierkegaard's perspective, these judgments that again are based in aesthetics. And if you don't know what aesthetics are, that's just, you know, kind of theories of beauty, theories of appeal, things that we find that render us happy or you know, appeal to us in some sort of way. And Kierkegaard says that we move from our childhood years to when we start developing better ideas, from aesthetic judgments to ethical judgments. And for him, that means judgments that are based on reason and not just a general sort of appeal. And so, you know, we talked about this earlier this semester when we were talking about Hein's dilemma, about how you know, Kohlberg even thought that this was true, that children, as they start to develop, will be able to reason that something may be good for them, but it's not good generally for everybody, or something may be good for them, but it's not good for the future kind of prospects that they have with other people, and so maybe they shouldn't do it. And Kierkegaard thinks that, you know, we establish extremely elaborate sorts of judgments. We establish extremely elaborate ideas about ethics, and ultimately our judgments become better reasoned sorts of judgments. And then he kind of turns this around and really says, but how is it that we ever get to becoming better at reasoning about the world? It is like, how is it that we go from a complete ignorance of the world to having the knowledge that we do of the world? And what is so interesting to him is that he thinks this ultimately happens through what he calls a leap of faith. If we go back to the beginning of the school year, you know, all of you sat down in your chairs, and I didn't see any of you really question the stability of your chairs. And as the semester went on, you got even better at sitting in the chairs that you found, and you tended to sit down in the same sort of place. And there's a certain kind of faith that you put into the chairs, a faith that has now been tested with the coronavirus, right? But overall, you went from you know, trying to figure out in a timid sort of fashion what chair you were going to sit in, to ultimately choosing the chair that you knew belonged to you and that you were going to sit in. And from Kierkegaard's perspective, he thinks that in order to get to this position, again, from just kind of this baseline ignorance or this baseline full understanding of the universe, right? Again, just an ignorance of the world. In order to move from that, from what we don't know, into what it is that we do know, what we can meaningfully say about the universe, about the world, we have to go by an experience that is unfamiliar to us. And so sometimes this is how people who are called mystics think about the world in religion, is that to get to a place of understanding, you have to go through the path of ignorance. And so Kierkegaard points out what he calls the leap of faith, that he says in order for us to actually have a real experience of the world, for us to break out from our bubble universe and our bubble experience into something that is unknown and unfamiliar to us, and ultimately to make ourselves better human beings, we have to take a leap of faith from the standpoint of the things that we know about the universe into the things that are unknown, into the things that we don't know about. And what's interesting to him is that he doesn't think that this leap that we take is based entirely on good, sound reasons that we have. So, for instance, the reason why you may decide to get in your car and drive somewhere, the way that could end up could be one of many ways, right? Like you could run out of gas, you could crash into somebody else's car, or you could arrive somewhere that you've never been before and find a place that you really, really like. Part of the unknown is how it's going to end. And for Kierkegaard's perspective, this is actually what it means, and in a large part, to be a human being, is to embrace the unknown and to follow through with what he calls our inwardness, or what he means by that is subjective experience. Ultimately, it's your intuition that drives you towards where you're going. And so he looks at the fact of someone like Abraham being told by God to go and kill his son. And for him, this isn't really anything to do with a principle that we can reason through, because for him, things like that are restraints towards us being able to actually explore the world. He says that we have to take a leap of faith if we're going to be true to ourselves, and get anywhere that is good in a meaningful sense of the word good. And he says that the lack of people being able to take that kind of leap of faith, and falling back on rational principles, ultimately strips them of their ability to find something that's good. If we were to take this maybe one step further, I'd point out the fact that the person who first created the cure for the pox injected his son with it first. And if we look at that, we could say, like, what a monster that person is, right? Like, why would you inject your own son with something that you know is incurable? But by the same point, we don't think of that person like that. Again, they took a leap of faith, and in so doing, they were able to find a cure. Currently in the situation that we have with the coronavirus, we could look at a similar scientist doing the exact same thing. Someone who is looking for a vaccine and decides, right, they're going to test it out on a couple of people. And maybe instead of finding a vaccine, they just find a way to exacerbate the problem, right, and kill people who have the coronavirus even faster. And if that's the case, should we look at that person and say, well, that person was a monster? What were they doing? And if the result is that they find a cure, right, and we don't have to quarantine ourselves anymore, we can meet face to face, is that really a good reason for saying, well, they were acting on a moral principle? From Kierkegaard's perspective, we shouldn't invest in either one of these ideas. Instead, for him, the nature of goodness, the nature of morality, is tied to this leap of faith, is tied to this ability to move past reasoned principles, reasoned experiences, and to trust your own intuition. And so that's ultimately how he comes up with his principle for the leap of faith. Again, if you have any questions about this, go ahead and post them on the discussion board now. Otherwise, it's been fun talking to you all, and you have a wonderful day.